All right.
Hi there. This is David Roberts, the senior staff writer for energy and energy politics at Grist.org. I'm on the phone with Ronald Bailey, who is the science correspondent at Reason magazine, which is put out by the Libertarian Reason Foundation, and he is on the ground in Copenhagen. How's it going, Ronald?
Things are going well. We've had, well for me anyway. I finally got inside the venue after freezing to death for 6 hours out in the cold. But things are going interesting. It's you get a sense of the kinds of blockages and so forth that the world faces through a UN process. Very definitely.
Yeah, I've heard from a number of people who are over there that logistically it seems like a complete cluster. You know what?
Yeah.
Has that been your experience so far?
Yeah, this is the sixth one of these that I've covered, and this is by far logistically the most chaotic and maddening that I've been to. It's just amazingly bad. And actually it provokes me to think the following. Why do you think... It's kind of hard to imagine that people who organize this conference are also the same people we expect to run the planet's climate eventually, too. But anyway.
I thought the Northern Europeans were supposed to be noted for their efficiency, and this is really disillusioning.
Well, what's interesting is that I'm staying with a Danish family, and every time I come home, they go, "Is it the Danes' fault? Is it the Danes' fault?" And I'm going, "No, it's the UN's fault."
Blame the UN.
Right.
That's what it's there for. All right. Well, let's talk about a couple of things that are going on there. The big news today was Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, came over and gave a speech and made news by announcing that the U.S. would contribute to long-term, large-scale funding for the developing world in exchange for transparency measures from China. Can you say something about what she announced and what effect, if any, you think it'll have?
Well, there was some what she announced was that basically the United States would contribute to a fund that would disperse $100 billion a year, every year, leading up to and starting after 2020. And what was interesting is that Ivo de Boer, who is the executive secretary of the conference, was asked, well, what do you think of that? And he says, well, that's very good. We like that. We think that it's going to be moving the process along. But everybody's really curious about how much money the United States is actually going to toss in. That figure was not mentioned. But she was trying to make a bargain in a certain sense with the Chinese who about transparency. The problem is that the Chinese, as you know, made some statements that they were going to increase their carbon intensity by 45% by 2020, which means that for making a given amount of GDP, they would use only 55% as much carbon to make it by 2020. That isn't an actual reduction. They're not going to be reducing. In fact, their emissions are expected to go up by 50% by 2020, as a matter of fact. So the United States understands they're a developing country and don't want necessarily to say this is a bad idea, but they are saying, well, that's very nice, but we'd like to be able to check to make sure that you're actually doing it. And the Chinese are going, well, no, that's a violation of sovereignty, and we're not going to do that.
Is that? I've been wondering about this actually. I know China reacts violently when that's suggested. Is it just about national pride and sovereignty, or is there something beyond that?
Well, I put it this way: I'd hate to be on the other side of a contract negotiation with these guys. They are sticklers to every jot and tittle of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also the Bali roadmap that came out 2 years ago. And they are basically saying none of these obligations apply to developing countries, including us, and we are not going to let them happen that way. So they're very close to sticking with what has already been agreed upon in the past, and they're not moving from that as far as we can tell right now. The flip side of it is if they don't do it, it appears that the United States will not be able to sign anything here.
Now, is it fair to say that this clash between the U.S. and China, the U.S. coughing up more money, China coughing up more transparency, is the central the central dispute that's holding back an agreement, or are there others of similar
there are a whole bunch of them.
significance?
There are a lot of them of significance. What you get is, let's go through them. One of them is the long-term goal for what the temperature of the Earth should become by the year 2100, let's say. And the current view the Europeans have is that it should be about 2 degrees centigrade, and the United States hasn't committed one way or the other. I mean, they did in the G8 process earlier, so there is that the planet should warm 2 degrees centigrade. But the small island states and a bunch of other countries are pushing for 1.5 degrees centigrade.
And 1.5 would be commensurate with the 350 parts per million number that's
that Bill McKibben and his group are yes, that would be apparently commensurate with that. And so that's another thing that a lot of people want to get into. Whatever the agreement is that this target of whatever the temperature should be in there, and nobody has agreed to do that yet. The other big deal besides transparency is the United States is not being considered, how should we say, ambitious enough in its goals for cutting carbon dioxide. As you know, the Waxman-Markey bill just passed the House in June has a reduction of 17% carbon dioxide emissions by 2020. But that would be, according to the Europeans and everybody else, that would mean that we were actually cutting. Well, and the baseline for that is 2005. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that the baseline that the Europeans use and everybody else seems to use is 1990. And if you use that baseline, it would mean we had agreed to cut our carbon dioxide emissions by 4%, which doesn't sound very ambitious to a lot of people here. So they're really pushing to get that changed. On the other side, the American negotiators are very upfront, saying, we don't think we can move it. Congress hasn't agreed to do that kind of thing, and we can't take that number back to Congress.
I wonder how well understood it is among in the international community how constrained Obama is by Congress. I mean, he clearly doesn't want to promise something that Congress hasn't already agreed to, and Congress really hasn't even agreed to that yet. The bill's still stuck in the Senate, but he's taking somewhat of a chance by even committing to that. But I mean, do other countries understand that no matter how hard they push Obama, he's not the one that's holding that target down?
Well, I hope they do, because we've had a whole flock of American legislators come in to talk about it and try to educate them about it. I was just at a press conference with Nancy Pelosi, who brought as far as I can tell, the entire leadership of the House Democratic leadership over to go to the conference. And they were, making good noises about, how wonderful we are and what commitments we've made, but I don't think that it happened to fly with the audience very well. Everybody's trying to push Obama for, quote, greater ambition. I just don't see how they're going to be able to pull that off.
It's that. I mean, this is what I keep saying on the blog over and over again. Is it's not Obama that's lacking ambition. I'm sure Obama would happily sign on to more ambitious targets. It's if our international partners want us to move, they should be calling Evan Bayh or Max Baucus or Ben Nelson. And
I don't think,
but they don't for greater ambition.
Yeah, but they don't vote in Illinois or Indiana or in Montana, so I don't think the calls would matter. Right.
So the question is, what can the U.S. do? I mean, Obama has been sending cabinet officials over all last week and this week, all of whom have been saying in their various ways, look at all these things the executive branch can do. With the new mileage standards and the stimulus bill funding of various things, they're all trying to show we are making progress, even though U.S. Congress is deadlocked like usual. But I wonder, given that Obama can't really move on those short-term targets, and he can't really promise a lot more funding than is in the Waxman-Markey bill, what can the U.S. budge on? I mean, what could the U.S. do to concede if it wanted to concede something?
Well, the one thing they could concede would be transparency. They could just let China get away with saying, well, yes, we've set our targets, and we'll check it, and we'll report them to you. And how persuasive that will be, I don't know. But they could budge on that. We just were at a press conference again with the vice minister from the foreign ministry of China, and they were just seriously going down the list of things that they weren't going to budge on. And it's 24 hours before it's more. They're supposed to officially close this at 3 p.m. tomorrow. No one here believes that will happen. We'll probably go into Saturday. So
who is there now? Right, the Chinese premier is there on the ground.
Premier Zhao Wan is here. And Hugo Chavez was here. He had a really good star turn denouncing capitalism yesterday in a speech that was supposed to be 5 minutes. It was 45 minutes.
Yes, Hugo Chavez said if the climate was a bank, the U.S. would have saved it already. Which is
he's a wordsmith. There's no question about it.
Yeah, that one stings a little bit.
On the other hand, of course, his country and his regime survive almost solely on the export of oil. So I'm not sure what he gets off about.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so this, my assumption is that the Chinese, everything I've heard about the Chinese is that they are extremely tough negotiators, and if they're going to budge on anything, it won't be until the last minute of the last day, if that. So, in a sense, the entire 2 weeks has been waiting for that last hour.
I'm afraid that's exactly right.
When everything of significance will happen.
Well, but the previous way this played out before Obama was president is that everybody could gang up on the United States, and the Chinese would just gang up with everybody else on the United States, and the United States was the evil one, the bad one, and therefore China never got looked at. Nobody was thinking, maybe the Chinese are not following along as well as they should with this. And I don't think they're feeling very comfortable right now because their good friends, the European Union, are also pushing them to move on this.
And so it seems like one of the big stories has been a split in the G77. So you have these fast developing countries, China and India, which obviously would prefer to be let off with relatively mild emission reductions, and then you have these small island states and the poorest states, which are facing what is in their eyes an existential threat. Like their countries are literally in danger of going underwater. So now the Tuvalu premier made a big splash the other day by coming out and calling for mandatory emission reductions from China and India, which was a fairly big break in what has traditionally been a unified developing bloc, precisely because the U.S. is no longer focusing their ire. Do you think that's going to amount to anything?
Actually, it could be an interesting split. Part of the other thing is that you probably know that the African Union came up with a proposal, which is basically what Secretary of State Clinton came up with, is that we'll be happy to take $100 billion a year in 2020. And so by agreeing to do that, they may have split off from China. It's a very interesting process. It's very hard to get your arms around all this stuff. Let's go back to this climate damage thing. We might have a little bit of controversy over that. The problem is there are two interesting things about that. Africa contributes about 3% of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere currently, right? This is a continent of 600 million people, and only 3%.
Right.
It's possible that the 20 biggest emitters got together. They could cut a deal themselves and forget Africa. Why would we pay them anything? They're not,
And that's what they're worried will happen if we abandon the Kyoto framework. That's their worry, right?
Exactly, and but in terms of actually saving the planet, if that's what you think is what this process will end up doing, it would be more efficient and effective to just do that. I hate to say it, but that would be the case.
Yes, there's this push from NGOs in African countries to sort of put this notion of climate debt on the table and make it part of the background of the talks. I just wrote a post about this, actually, about the notion of climate debt and its implications. I mean, sort of the casual conclusion you draw from, I mean, well, just to back up, climate debt is this, as you know, is this notion that the U.S. and Western countries have contributed most of historical greenhouse gas emissions. I think something like 75% of the cumulative total to date have come from Western countries as they developed on fossil fuels. And so the idea is, having used up what is effectively a finite resource, they owe it to countries that haven't developed yet to help them develop along cleaner lines. So, I mean, in a mild interpretation, that could just mean this sort of notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is part of the framework of these talks, which is just that Western countries need to do more and reduce emissions more, which I think is relatively uncontroversial at this point. But as I said in my post, if you really take this seriously, if you take seriously the idea that the atmosphere is a collective trust owned by all of humanity, and that in a sense all human beings have a right to an equal portion of it, that if you follow that line of reasoning, you come to some fairly radical conclusions. I mean, for one thing, you come to the notion that we should target by, say, 2050 or so, and this is something the small island nations have talked about, we should target by 2050 having a system in which per capita emissions, everyone on Earth has an equal right to the same per capita emissions, and that would involve really, really radical changes in the global economy and global balance of power, and so
which means it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so the conclusion of my post was something. I mean, putting aside its philosophical or moral merits, something that's so such a explosive is not going to be a practical tool for getting this deal done.
Well, no, but the other way to look at it, and I realize it's not popular to do so, as much as there may be a climate debt, there's also, in a certain sense, a technological and development debt. The fact of the matter is that in 1900, the least developed countries were still least developed. They didn't have modern medicines. Their average lifespan was 30 years or so. They have massive amounts of maternal death at birth. I mean, there was just all kinds of problems like that. No roads, no cell phones, no nothing. And the fact of the matter is that all that industrialization that is being decried actually provided them with the benefits that gave them the modern world and allowed at least their leaders to come here in Copenhagen to freeze to death.
Right.
So,
that's well. As I said in my post, there's debts and then there's credits of some sort, right? I mean, medicine and technology and literature. I mean, ultimately, who's gonna be the entity that tallies up this cosmic ledger and enforces its results? So, I mean, my point was just, you get the same conclusion. You can get to the conclusion that the developed world ought to transfer a lot of money to the developing world without quite so radical a premise. I mean, it's a practical matter for the developed world. I think it has to happen to make a deal possible, and also I don't think it's in the developed world's interest to have the developing world beset by floods and refugee crises, and I mean, it would be to our benefit to have them develop in a clean way and become trading partners and become markets for our innovations and whatever else. So you can get there without that argument.
Right, but I agree. But the problem is that, and look at it this way again about this notion of this climate aid fund. Right? Mm-hmm. Bill Easterly, who used to be a World Bank economist, has pointed out that the Western world has spent in real dollars $2.3 trillion or $2.4 trillion since 1960 in the developing world, right, to help them. Overseas development aid, economic aid, whatever. And we have almost nothing to show for it in terms of actual GDP growth in these countries. And so the question is that how in the world do you think that giving $100 billion in climate aid is going to be managed any better than what happened in the past?
Right. And I mean, I think in just as a partial response, I think that it could be argued that the developed world has has offered aid, but also via the IMF and World Bank some policies that haven't exactly been good for fostering a middle class in the developed world. I mean, it's not like it's not like all our actions have been benign. But the point stands.
Not that their regimes have been very good for their middle classes.
I mean,
either,
I'm trying to envision the institutions that would disperse $100 billion a year through these countries that would work well. And I haven't heard even much talk about it.
Well, actually, this is interesting because the least developed countries have already figured this out. They want to be able to run the group that disperses the money.
Well,
so they know what they want.
Amazing that they assessed the situation and came to that conclusion.
And came up with the objective way to do this.
Yeah, but I mean, this is, there's a sort of a mirror of this in a domestic debate right now, which is all the stimulus money going out, and there's this, and I follow the topic of efficiency and building efficiency, and there's this worry in the States that there's all this money available now, but we don't quite have the institutions and the mature markets and everything up and ready to absorb that kind of money in a productive way on the speed we're trying to get to, and now that problem times a million with these countries who aside from having no particularly mature markets and market institutions, a lot of them are pretty notorious for having repressive and corrupt governments, and it's surprising to me that there's been so much cavalier talk of dumping this enormous amount of money on them, and so little talk of how to ensure that results are obtained.
At the risk of contradicting you a little bit, there has been a lot of talk about what to do with the money should the funds be available. What has happened, and this is one of those transparency issues that's come up again, is that the Western countries, Europe and the United States in particular, are saying, well, yeah, all right, if we do that, we need to have a system for monitoring what happens to the money. We're going to have oversight, and we're going to have to really make sure it goes to where it's supposed to. And again, there's been a huge pushback from on sovereignty grounds again, from the developing world, saying, no, we don't want to have that kind of intrusive violation of our sovereignty. Don't worry, we'll take care of the money. And
how about this? We'll pay you $100 billion to intrude a little bit.
Yeah. And so but that has been a pushback here, is that no, we don't really want to have that. And to a certain extent, a lot of the what we'll call civil society here, the NGOs, have been abetting the developing world in that direction. They've been basically saying, yeah, that's right, they should be allowed to have this money. There's a kind of charming trust on the part of the NGO community. They think that all of a sudden incompetent and sometimes corrupt governments will be able to handle these new inflows of what they would regard as free money, and I don't think that's realistic.
Yeah, it seems to me there's a kind of a moralism that overlays this discussion, particularly among NGOs, but among everybody. This sort of this frame of the Western world, and its many predations against the developing world, and this debt notion, which is effectively an ethical notion. I worry that this moralism obscures the practical issues. I mean, no matter what your thoughts on whether the developing world deserves that money or whatnot, if you, just as a practical matter, if you're going to give them money, you'd like to see maximum possible results, and
right.
It's the same as the way you'd assess any country. You'd like maximum results from spending in the U.S. or anywhere else. So.
Well, but the thing that we need to do, and this is maybe where we would disagree, is the policies that we should be developing are the ones that actually help them to grow, so that they can not be poor anymore, so they don't need aid. And that goes into a much longer discussion of globalization and how that could be actualized. But the fact of the matter is that it is possible for poor countries to get rich. China and India are showing that. Taiwan, Thailand, I mean, a lot of places have shown that in the last century or so, and there's no reason why Bangladesh couldn't do that too, except for the fact they have a government that is kleptocratic, truth be known.
Yeah, I would like to see, alongside all the discussions of monetary aid, more discussions of sort of institutional reform and things like that, things that can adapt these countries, because you can't develop, clean or otherwise, if you can't develop. I mean, my friend Alex Steffen made a good point the other day, which is that and it was along these lines of all the many things that developed countries could do to help developing countries that aren't just suitcases full of money. And his point was, if we could loosen up and rationalize international intellectual property law, that would do more to foster innovation in the developing world than a suitcase full of money would. I mean, and you can think of other laws that could change and other institutions that could change. But as you say, when you move beyond the suitcase full of money discussion to these sort of institutional reform discussions, you start treading up against some very old and very contentious disputes and very sort of, fundamental questions about how the world economy works, and people are uncomfortable, I think, going there.
I think that's correct. But in any case, where are we going from here?
Let's move on briefly. I know that you are not a fan of the international carbon trading system.
No, it's a complete failure.
The U.S. is in the midst of slowly and fitfully hooking itself into.
Tell me what you think's so wonderful about it, and then I'll explain to you why it's not so good.
The longer I've been covering this stuff, the more I've come to see all politically realistic options as fairly awful. So the discussion is compared to what? I mean, this is my question: is compared to what? I mean, I know domestically we're having this endless dispute over cap and trade versus carbon tax versus various other policies, and over again I come to somebody show me in realistic terms the votes, the steps whereby we go from these sort of idealized solutions to laws and regulations that pass. Show me an alternative that lives in the real political world and has some chance of succeeding, then I'm convinced. But the fact that idealized policies are preferable to sausage making in the real world, I think, is practically tautological and not very helpful in moving forward.
I can't believe you're making that argument. That's the kind of argument that, how shall we say, libertarians are always making to environmentalists, who are always putting up the perfect as opposed to the possible, as far as I'm concerned.
I have a running dispute with lots of people in the environmental world about this. We have this weird left-right coalition that's emerging against cap and trade, and as I say to my environmental brethren, this is ugly and it's a half step and there's lots of flaws. But what do you think is going to happen if this bill blows up and fails and the international treaty fails? Do you think everybody's going to return next year filled with a renewed sense of purpose and starting from ground zero with your perfect policy? No. Failure in politics is like touching your hand to a hot stove. Every legislator is going to run the other way and want to deal with other issues and deal with other things, and they will learn that this is a sinkhole with all costs and no benefits, and they'll never return to it. I mean, that's my take anyway.
Well, I have no love for either party, so I'll just say this, though. If this cap and trade bill passes in the form that it looks like it's going to be, the Democrats will be out of power in 2012.
It won't even go into effect until 2012.
I know, but the other team, which I also dislike intensely, will certainly use that as a whipping horse for that particular election. In fact, the Democrats are going to lose in 2010 as it is over this kind of thing. But that's another issue.
I think Democrat losses in 2010 are overdetermined, as it were. I mean,
that's probably true. That's true.
I do think it's going to be a bad year, but my inclination is to say that successfully passing a clean energy bill, almost whatever it looks like, is a hell of a lot better optics than the massive failure of one of Obama's central policy priorities. I don't see any way that that's preferable in terms of optics, in terms of how it looks to the electorate, than sitting and signing something.
Because he could run on a lot of other things that are probably going to pass that I also don't like, that a lot of people will like. So, but that's another issue. But the reason, let's think about the cap and trade situation. The European Union, is a nice civilized place, a very advanced bureaucratic civilization, and they have been unable to use cap and trade to do any of the things that you're promising and people are promising with the cap and trade bill. I just at the press conference today, Nancy Pelosi was saying this is going to spark an amazing technological revolution, the cap and trade. And I'm going, well, if that were the case, if cap and trade were going to do that, why aren't we seeing signs of that in Europe? As a matter of fact, Europeans are right now planning to build more coal plants.
Well, let me make 2 points in response to that. One is, I think that this notion that the EU trading system has been a spectacular failure is way overplayed. I think the argument can be made that everybody knows that when it went into effect, there were some pretty glaring flaws, mainly having to do with the fact that they
many of which we are now replicating, by the way.
Yes.
Okay.
We're replicating the very legislators who most often complain about the European system and most often complain about the inefficiency and complexity of cap and trade are busy making it more complex and putting more loopholes in it for their favored constituencies.
Precisely. So why do you think it's going to work in the U.S.?
Which is an irony, but the EU system has been improving, has been tightening up, and is starting to bite a little bit. So my second point is, I think the idea that any carbon pricing policy, and that includes cap and trade or carbon tax, the idea that any price on carbon is going to spark a clean energy innovation revolution in this country in the next 10 years is just false. I don't think that any politically realistic price on carbon is going to bite hard enough and fast enough to drive those kind of changes. Now, I draw different conclusions from that than you probably.
Okay.
My point would be to say, put the legal framework for a price in carbon in place, knowing realistically that it's not going to be your main policy driver for the next 10 years, but put it there. That's a foundation for future fights. It's a foundation for future pushing. But if you want the clean energy revolution that people on the ground will see and the kind of thing that will build political support, because what builds political support is not arguments. What builds political support is ordinary people seeing their lives being changed for the better by policy, right? So if you want that, if you want changes on the ground,
a very rare and wonderful occurrence.
A rare and wonderful occurrence. If you want that on the ground, you need a suite of complementary policies. A, you need these big investments from the stimulus bill, and B, you need a lot of targeted investments. You need industrial policy. You need sector-specific regulations. All these things that I'm sure you were going to.
Oh yeah, industrial policy has been really successful.
All these things are going to bridle against, but I think it's going to be those more fine-grained policies that have short-term effects. So that's why ultimately, despite all its flaws, I kind of liked ACES that passed the House because it had the long-term carbon pricing framework, but it also had this suite of efficiency regulations and everything else that I think are going to spark some short-term action and are going to be visible to people on the ground. I assume you disagree with all of that.
I don't disagree. Well, yeah, I probably do disagree with it all, because a carbon tax, if you wanted to get more efficient appliances and so forth, you would get that because people would be paying more for electricity, and they would know that. But just as an aside, before we dismiss the idea of a carbon tax entirely, which is if we have to do something, and I'm just going to say, if we have to do something, it's the least bad thing we can do. I think you probably know this, actually, is that the French have adopted one. And they've adopted a clean one. They've adopted one with a complete rebate. Now, if the French could do that,
I haven't been following. I know. I heard the back and forth over that over time. I wasn't. I don't know what the current status of it is.
The ideal one that, from my point of view, would be if you impose a carbon tax, you impose it on fossil fuels at the wellhead and the mine head, right? And go from there, and it flows through the economy, and the tax is collected at that point, and then rebated entirely to Americans. You just give them a big check, maybe once a month or once a year.
Well, we should just pause to note that there are some devils in the details of how that rebate would work.
Course.
But the idea, I'm familiar with the idea.
Of course, but this is very much the idea that the French have just pulled off. We'll see if they'll be able to succeed with it.
We'll see if it works. But here's my problem.
Oh, and I should mention John Kerry himself here at the conference whispered the words carbon tax as a possibility. He basically,
this new bill got introduced in the Senate.
Exactly.
Which is I think an extremely and probably fatally flawed attempt at doing roughly what you're talking about.
I haven't analyzed it, so I don't know. So be honest.
The Cantwell-Collins bill. Well, a lot of people are hyping it because it's in the neighborhood of a fully rebated carbon tax, but there are flaws in the details that I think are gonna sink it. But the hope is, I think the reasonable hope is that if enough senators come out supporting that bill, it will make an impression on Kerry's tripartisan crew he's got going, and they'll say, hey, maybe people support a more simple and rational setup for our allocations. But
in which case, you'll jump on board for it, right?
Well, look, if they want to simplify the allocation process, auction more permits, up the amount of rebates, reduce the amount of offsets, I will be in the front lines cheerleading. I mean, that's
not going to happen.
If that bill can pass the Senate, I would be dancing a jig. I think you're right that it's the worst flaws in the policy that make it politically
possible,
viable, which is ironic. But let me just ask on a more abstract level, an economic point. I mean, my problem with this, I get the sort of theoretical appeal of this notion of an upstream carbon tax, so you're sort of intervening as little as possible, you're taxing as few entities as possible, and you're sort of letting that carbon price flow down from those entry points where fossil fuels enter the economy. You price them there, and that price flows down throughout the economy, and the marketplace responds to it in rational fashion, and all is well in the world. I get the appeal as it's sketched out on a whiteboard, but it seems to me one of the assumptions behind that is we have what is now a free market, a reasonably free market with low barriers to entry and exit, and the protections against monopolies and transparent information and all these other features of ideal markets. And we have this precious free market, and we want to muck with it as little as humanly possible. So we're just going to go to one end of it and do this thing. But it seems to me, especially when it comes to energy and carbon pollution, you have a market that is just riddled with market failures at every conceivable stage, and riddled with barriers to information flow, and riddled with
I'm not sure I understand. What examples of information flows?
To take one example, the primary institutions for distributing electricity. I mean, I think you and I would probably agree that electricity is going to be the big game in the next 50 years as the transportation fleet electrifies and more and more energy use moves to electricity. The primary instruments for distributing electricity in this country is this half-regulated monopolies, half-regulated monopolies, and half semi-unregulated monopolies in various states of being deregulated, which is this is incredibly Rube Goldbergian complex system. And these regulated monopolies have been regulated, and their profits have been protected, and they've been protected from competition for decades. And as a result, there's been no innovation in that.
It's the least innovative sector of our economy, period.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you where they innovate is in new ways of manipulating public utility commissioners
Yeah.
to give them their money. So right there you have, at dead center of the American energy economy, something that that would give Adam Smith the heebie-jeebies. So I just don't see. Well, I think I'd be in favor of some form of deregulation, and this actually has struck me as a place where environmentalists and libertarian-minded people could find a lot of areas to work together. It seems to me there's lots of irrational or perverse regulatory regulations in place that are impeding the development of clean energy and impeding the move away from fossil fuels.
As I'm sure you know, I just did some reporting on cogeneration. The fact of the matter is that utilities have stood in the way for that, for decades.
Yeah, and that's cogeneration, which, in case our viewers aren't familiar with it, is taking waste heat from various from power plants or industrial processes or factories, taking the waste heat that's vented, and using that heat to either run an electricity generator or to heat, to use it for heat for nearby buildings. So you're co-generating electricity and heat is the idea, and this is one of the fastest, cheapest, cleanest, most ready-to-hand mechanisms we have for reducing CO2 emissions, but it is impeded from spreading almost entirely by
government regulations,
utility regulations. So this seems to me. I think the sort of cultural hostility between environmentalists and libertarians has prevented a coalition from forming that could just go through and remove some of these perverse regulations. Of course, I would go on to add a variety of regulations.
There you see.
But that's why we can go half the way together, right? So, but my larger point is just, and also you say, and it's been to go back to something you said earlier. If we raise the price of energy, people will start taking advantage of efficiency investments. It's been, I think, shown pretty comprehensively at this point that there are efficiency investments available to people now that have a positive return, that by any sort of measure of rational self-interest, people already should be making, and they're not. And so there's a lot of economists out there studying efficiency right now, trying to figure out what are the barriers that are preventing people from acting in a way that sort of traditional economics says they ought to act, which is they ought to be rational self-interest maximizers, but they're not maximizing their self-interest.
And you know the answer to that is that they're maximizing their efficiency over the whole of their lives. They're not worrying about just one little sector. I mean, if you think about it, energy in the United States occupies, 5% of somebody's budget most of the time? Maybe 10%. So you got to maximize the rest of it. So basically, when you're saying they ought to be doing that, they're saying, I got this other 90% of my life I got to worry about. It's food and vacations and
sure, but I'm not even just talking about I'm not even just talking about residential. I'm talking about
I understand
big businesses and factories.
Well,
and you're right. So
energy
for somebody who's running Coke
inexpensive, it's not been that big a deal.
Right. So say somebody's running a Coke plant.
Well, that's where cogeneration works beautifully.
Yeah. So that investment is available to him, but most of them aren't making it, and it's because, as you say, when you're in business. In the Coke business, you want to focus on doing that, and you don't have any incentive to create in-house expertise on energy efficiency. So anyway, my point being, there are a number, I think, of relatively unobtrusive ways of maturing some of those markets and getting information to people about what's available to them and aggregating purchases such that you can get discounts from scale. And there's all sorts of policy interventions that could accelerate efficiency investments. I think really substantially.
But the policy intervention that would, for example, just as a minor example again, the Coke thing that you mentioned, because of the reporting I did on this, I know fairly well what's happened in that, is that most states have regulations that, in fact, do not allow Coke. The Coke. We should explain what Coke factories are, right? They basically turn coal they turn coal into a very high carbon source of fuel for smelting iron and steel. Okay,
right.
And so they use a lot of heat. They produce a huge amount of heat, and the problem
blow it out
in the
atmosphere
atmosphere for no good reason. The problem is that the coke companies have never thought about doing this because the regulations have said no, you may not sell whatever electricity you generate outside your plant. They don't need any more electricity. So. Right. And so it's not, when you say that it's a market inefficiency, that has nothing to do with the market. It had everything to do with the way the government set up, the public utility situation set it up, and the utilities bought the public utility commissions to set it up that way so that prevent these people from competing with them for their electricity supply.
Right.
So
well,
I think
they've created a market failure, right? You have a market failure because you have
it's
a lot
of
government
failure. It's
not
a market failure. It's a government failure.
Well, however you want to put it.
Regulations cause no. It's a big difference. The coke companies, I would predict to you that the coke companies would be generating electricity today if it weren't for those idiotic regulations.
Well, yes,
they wouldn't have missed that efficiency. That you think
here's what I think we would agree on. And I don't know how many of my, environmentalists would agree with this. I would actually be interested to find out. I know, like RFK Jr. is big on this line, but my instinct is to say, to the extent that energy markets in the U.S. could be made more perfect, i.e., more along the lines of the kind of ideal market that you read about in Economics 101. Where information flows easily, low barriers to entry and exit, whatever else, the sort of idealized market. To the extent energy markets could be made more like that, I think decarbonization would be happening naturally.
Well,
I think decarbonization would have been happening much faster than it has been happening, and I think it's various barriers in the way of those. And of course, the big glaring one, as I know you agree, is that fossil fuel power does not have to pay for the variety of damages it does to public health, to the atmosphere, to various ecological systems. So that is tantamount to every bit of those externalities that they're not forced to pay is tantamount to a massive subsidy to fossil fuels. And there was just a report came out earlier this year. I wish I had it with me. I forget the name of the think tank that put it out, but they were looking at trying to sort of quantify some of the externalities of fossil fuel, and they mainly focused on public health. But the striking finding to me was in the U.S. the coal industry produces about $62 billion a year in public health problems in asthma and they didn't even look at mercury, and they didn't look at climate change. They didn't look at a whole range of damages you could trace back to coal. They just looked at sort of respiratory illnesses, and in just that area alone, that's a $62 billion a year subsidy to the U.S. coal industry. And if that subsidy were removed, that market distorting subsidy were removed, obviously renewables would look a lot more competitive with coal. If coal was paying anything close to its true cost, you'd have a very different looking market right now, and I think that's true.
I think that there's a possibly good argument there. I always am worried about these numbers that are generated by people with a point of view, shall we say. And you know what I mean. But what's interesting to me is that did they also look at the benefits of the electricity that was produced, the health that was produced by that, the fact that they run hospitals, that people are able to stay warm in the winter and not die? I mean, the thing is, we don't mine coal to hurt people. We mine it to produce mostly goods, and in fact, if it weren't mostly good, we wouldn't use it. And so this kind of cost-benefit analysis, when I hear that it's all bad, the fact is you can't do it that way. It's mostly good.
I don't think it's all bad. I think that its benefits are reflected in its market price, and many of its costs are not reflected in its market price. So I don't think it's true that we wouldn't use it if it was bad. I mean, the way we respond to those things is by the price signal on it. So I mean, to me, if you were starting fresh and you said, I have this new source of energy, and to get it, I'll have to blow up chunks of the oldest mountain range in the world, and I'll have to destroy some Appalachian communities, and I'll have to pollute well over 50% of the waterways in the U.S., and I'll have to create $62 billion of respiratory illness a year, and I'll have to pollute the climate with possibly civilization-threatening consequences. No one would go for that.
Of course not. But of course, nobody had that choice. They either had the choice of using wood and chopping down all the forests, or using coal, or freezing to death. So, I mean, be a little historically accurate. We weren't sitting back there in 1900 going, well, solar panels, nuclear power, or coal. We were going,
no, nobody made the choice. But now we have the choice, and to me it seems like the thing to do is to make the full consequences of that choice manifest in the market, and they're just not.
And a carbon tax would do that.
I think a carbon tax would be one step on a much longer road. I mean, I think this is probably where we part. I think the externality of climate damages is one unpriced externality from coal burning, but it's one of many. So, I mean, I think there's lots of things you can do to rationalize energy markets that go beyond a carbon price. And I also think that there are that given the markets and human beings' inability or unwillingness or inaptness at planning on these kind of extraordinary
Except, of course,
time horizons.
For very savvy government bureaucrats and environmental activists who are very good at planning.
I think it's easy. I don't think they have a detailed vision into the future, but I think it's easy at this point to assess the situation and say we need to use energy far more efficiently than we are now, because sooner or later we're going to have to stop using fossil fuels, and the sooner we start using energy more efficiently, the cheaper it will be over the 50 or 100 year time horizon. I mean, that doesn't seem to me to involve any particularly controversial
I think you're
projection.
saying that. I'm not persuaded. But may I give you an example of savvy energy planning on the part of your federal government? In the deep dark, when I was a much younger man, I was a federal energy regulator. And during the Carter administration, I got to watch this.
Oh no!
And I highly recommend you go back and read a National Academy of Sciences report on energy that came out in 1980 that was predicting how much energy the United States would be using now. By the way, we're using something like 30% less than they predicted we would be using. They missed that somehow. But then the next thing is, that what it was fascinating to watch is that, of course, we were going to run out of oil, right? That was the big energy crisis we were all having. So Jimmy Carter created the Synfuels Corporation and was going to spend $80 billion turning coal into 3 million barrels of oil a year for us now. Think of the carbon debt that would have had with that industrial policy from that government. I know there are scare stories, but at the same time, those people.
If you go back to the 70s and look at the effort that was done to drive efficiency in the 70s, it was incredibly successuel. Our carbon intensity was
you can't just focus on the only
declining
thing that you like from that period
until Reagan came in and blew it all up. We were on a great trajectory.
Reagan blew up Synfuels. He prevented this carbon debt that you would have been worried about now.
But he also blew up all the policies that were having beneficial effects. So, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to think of the solution at a stroke. But anyway,
I'm not sure that the government planners of today are any better or smarter than the government planners of 30, 40 years ago either. And I think you, as somebody concerned about the environment, should be very, very worried about that.
Well, I think. The broader
especially
point
when it's the UN, but anyway.
The broader point is, if you go back a few decades and look at consensus projections from all the most reputable, not just government bureaucrats, but private think tanks and foundations, whatever.
Sure.
Look at projections of energy use, energy mix.
They were completely wrong.
Pollution, at GDP growth. I mean, go look at a large-scale projection of the future of almost anything, and they're almost always wrong.
Why should we predict? Why should we go with the projections now?
Well, why should we use projections to try to claim that the cap and trade will be grotesquely expensive? It seems like the counter arguments are also based on.
Well, I think a clean cap and trade of the sort that I would dream up. The nice simple one. You basically sell all of the allowances and that kind of thing. that would be fine. But the fact of the matter is, the one that you think is politically possible is going to vastly increase the cost of actually fixing both the climate, and also it will make products vastly more expensive than they would have to be. And basically, you're going to be missing a lot of the energy benefits that you want from a cap and trade system by this. And you know that. You've already said it. So,
well, I think I think even a compromised, crappy cap and trade system that is improved over time, I think if we get to 2050 and look back, we'll say, thank God we did that. Even though it was messy, even though it was ugly, even though it was inefficient, and there's probably a path from A to B that would have been shorter and less expensive. In the end, human civilization never progresses like that. There's never a case of efficient democratic governance that yields perfect solutions. That's not available.
I agree.
So what do you do?
Well, the problem is that government solutions are win-lose solutions. Market solutions, if you get them right, and most of the time they are right, they're win-win solutions. You can drive efficiency through the market vastly faster than you can through government.
But I think government can take an active role in shaping markets such that they work better.
I just don't agree with that. There are just damn few examples of that.
We're probably not going to settle this one on blogging heads. But in the end, I think, to try to wrap up,
sure.
I think what's going to happen. Let's end with predictions, so we can come back and watch this in 10 years and embarrass ourselves. Yeah, my prediction is that both the U.S. and China will ultimately, in the next couple of days, come to some sort of agreement, some sort of exchange of financing for transparency, and that some sort of weak political agreement will come out of Copenhagen. Right. The larger question is, will that then spur the Senate to pass a bill? And if the Senate passes a bill, will that then spur the countries to get back together in Mexico City in 2010 to create a final legally binding treaty? It seems to me that's a pretty high-wire act, and the smart money is on the wheels coming off at some point. But
well, I'm not going to disagree. From where I'm sitting here today in Copenhagen, I can't disagree with that prediction. As I say, I've covered 5 prior to this. This is my 6th one, and every time they come up to this exact script, it's on the verge of collapse, everything's going to fall apart, and at the last minute they come up with some sort of political agreement, which, when you really look at it, doesn't amount to very much. So I'm afraid that, from your point of view, that's what you're going to get this time.
But I will contrast that with a more positive general prediction, in that I think that Greens, and this is something I feel like Greens ought to acknowledge more, they ought to smile more and be happier. But I think
you do work for a place that's doom and gloom with a smile or something, right?
With a sense of humor.
There you go.
So I think in many, many ways, history is, I think we're on the right side of history, and a lot of forces are moving in our direction. I think the pace of innovation in clean energy, even in the absence of coherent national policy in the U.S., but would be helped by some sort of coherent national policy, I think the pace of innovation is going to explode. I think moving off fossil fuels is going to, in the end, be much cheaper than we fear and project it's going to be, and happen much faster than we project it's going to be. And ultimately, this framework of discussion where everybody's trying to give up as little as possible and do as little as possible and get as much as possible is going to be loosened when there are more positive examples of countries and economies benefiting from aggressively pursuing this stuff. So I think in the long term, the future's fairly bright.
I always think the future's fairly bright, because I think people will avoid most of the problems that we believe are confronting us. But I should say this about your prediction. I think that either the countries that pursue clean tech will be good examples, or in my case, I'm afraid they may end up being horrible warnings. But we'll find out.
Yeah, we'll find out. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, and enjoy the rest of your
it was enjoyable chatting with you
there.
Do you ever come to D.C.?
I do.
Give me a holler. I'll buy you a beer.
All right, sounds good. Talk to you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.